So again, my name is Pastor Ben Hogue. I use he, him, his pronouns. I serve Lutheran Church, the Reformation. And the person that I am bringing into this is Peppermint. Peppermint is an actress, an activist, a drag performer. And I have known about Peppermint's work for a long time, though I recently met her at the Supreme Court. She did a rally for the Title VII cases, and she spoke when those cases were being discussed. And it was a beautiful moment for me in ministry to meet somebody that I admire a lot and their activism and work. And I think her voice is one that I'd like to bring into this meeting. So I'll ask Amanda and Kelsey to do the same, and then we'll get started. Amanda?
Thanks, Ben. My name is Amanda Gerken-Nelson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Executive Director of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. I am so delighted to be here with Ben, who is a seminary classmate, but also a proclaimed member, and also with Mike, who is a former board member and longtime supporter of ELM, and also with the people of Reformation, who have just shown such wonderful support to ELM. And many of you, thank you all so much for being here. When I thought about Ben's question and Kelsey's question around like, who am I bringing into this conversation with me? A year and a half ago, I was able to hear Angela Davis speak. And she talked about, she was kind of answering this question of like, what did she think about the relationship or what did she think about the Black Lives Matter movement in relationship to the movement that she was such a strong part of? She just talked about this like really beautiful relationship between elders and new generations and the ways that movements keep going and also addressing this idea of why do we say Black Lives Matter and not all lives matter? And her point was, and I don't say it as well as she did, but that when you center the most marginalized and you say their lives matter, all the rest of the lives matter, was kind of her point. When you center the most marginalized, if you work for a world in which the most marginalized is who you seek to be whole and healthy and safe in their life, it is very likely that those who aren't marginalized will also be able to live whole and healthy in their life. So I have imagined that in my own work to think about, as I advocate for LGBTQIA folks in our church, specifically to hold leadership positions of being a pastor or a deacon, what would it mean to center and think about advocating for the most marginalized? And I think in our community, that would be a trans woman of color previously incarcerated for sex work, who stands at the table, lifts the elements, and offers me the bread broken for me. So what does it mean for me to work for a church in which that person can be a pastor? And feel free, after this or in a message to let me know if I should be adding descriptors of who that person is, but that's who I bring with me into this meeting tonight and into my work. Kelsey.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
I was muted. I'm no longer muted. It's really funny that is who Amanda is bringing into the room. And I say funny because Amanda, Ben, and I had a chat yesterday on Zoom, and we talked about this question of who do we bring, but then we didn't say who we were bringing. So Pastor Ben brought a trans woman of color, and Amanda lifting up the most marginalized among us, which I also believe to be trans women of color, specifically folks that are previously incarcerated or those living with or affected by HIV and AIDS. And I am bringing into the room Sylvia Rivera, one of the heels in your face movers and shakers of the Stonewall riots. And alongside Sylvia, I bring the numerous amounts of trans Black women that were murdered this year, specifically Remy out of Philadelphia, because that city is close to my heart. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I serve as the pastor developer at Jesus Table, which is a Lutheran congregation of African descent in the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn in New York City. Wonderful. And I am so excited to be here.
Well, we are excited to have you both with us. And if maybe Amanda wants to tell us a little bit, but you both, Amanda, you're the executive director, and Kelsey, you're a board member of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. Tell us a little bit about the work of ELM. Give us that brief overview, and then we can sort of move forward in some of the history of what ELM has done.
Sure. So it's actually really exciting. We're celebrating in 2020 the 30th anniversary of the first extraordinary ordinations. They took place in January of 1990, and that along with the late 80s, when a few white gay men at PLTS, which is the seminary in California, came out as part of their candidacy process at a time when, you know, the only way to serve as a gay person was in the closet and to be single and celibate. And these young gay men flew to Washington for the March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, which is what it was called at the time, and were so moved by this uprising, right? This presence, this protest, this riot, of gathering of people in Washington, that when they came home, they said, we have to serve openly. And we have lived into the vision of those folks, as well as lay leaders in congregations who surrounded those folks with love and effort and money and advocacy. And so ELM has this history of kind of doing what the church wasn't doing, which was calling and ordaining LGBTQIA folk, and proudly with the support of congregations to make that happen. After 2009, we kind of switched the way that we did. I'm really kind of glossing over ELM's history, so let me know if any of this is points I should go back to, Ben or Mike or Kelsey. But after 2009, there was a door that had been opened that said that LGBTQIA folks could now serve and be in relationship, same-gender relationships, and could be publicly out. And so there was no longer a need for us to do what the church wasn't doing. Everybody who was on that roster was received onto the ELCA roster. So instead of having our own roster, the ELM board and visionaries at the time said, well, what would it look like to create a professional organization of LGBTQIA+ leaders? Still a place for respite, renewal, a place for sharing concerns, celebrations. And so we moved forward with a group called Proclaim. So when I said at the beginning that Pastor Ben was a member of Proclaim, that's that professional community of seminarians, pastors, and deacons serving in the Lutheran Church. And that group is now over 400 members. Instead of doing our own candidacy process, which we were doing before 2009, we recognize that everybody's going to now do the ELCA candidacy process, but changing a policy does not necessarily change people's hearts. And so we said, instead of having our own candidacy, let's walk alongside folks in the ELCA candidacy process. Let's do that in the form of advocacy. Let's have, people who can walk alongside, give advice, read essays, et cetera, and also work with candidacy committees to educate them on LGBTQIA+ identities. And then we also recognize that congregations call pastors. And so there was a real need to also do education and outreach within congregations to encourage them to call LGBTQIA pastors, which we had also been doing before for the extraordinary roster. So that's what we call ministry engagement. And it's really to help open up a diversity of calls for LGBTQIA folk in the church. As we are celebrating the 30th anniversary, we're also deeply mindful of the fact that when you celebrate, an anniversary like 30 years, you start thinking about what's the next 10 years, what's the next 20 years, what's the next, 30 years for an organization. And maybe Kelsey can speak a little bit to this too, or I think our conversation will. But I think right now, we realize that our ministry must stand in solidarity with and include a movement to dismantle racism and white supremacy in the church. And in our own midst as an organization, recognizing the ways that we as a white church are reflected in a ELM, which is a predominantly white organization. And as Pastor Ben said, LGBTQIA folk come in a wonderful diversity of bodies. And what we kind of find right now, and where we're thinking about in our own strategic planning, is if you are a cisgender, white, gay male, it's very likely you'll find a call within our church within a good amount of time. If you vary from any of those categories, so for example, if you are a trans, Black, woman, lesbian, I'm just adding the different, variations you can have, and even differently abled, add time for each of those descriptors in terms of how long it will take you to get a call. Add a significant amount of microaggressions and macroaggressions that you'll experience in the process and in the church. And it's all the more advocacy and activism that's needed from our organization today to be addressing, these issues in the church, that there's still a deep call within our church to be paving a path and protecting our folks from gatekeeping. So that's kind of it really in a nutshell, and I'd be happy to speak more about different parts of it, but that's kind of where we are and where we've been.
Yeah, and Kelsey, from a board level, what is that looking like for the organization? You mentioned, I think to me, you've been in person to one of the board meetings as a relatively newer board member, but what does that look like for ELM as an organization? Again, not an organization of the ELCA, but that's accompanying seminarians and pastors and deacons, rostered folks who are in the ELCA.
So I think that something that ELM has done very well as me coming in as a board member is listening to the voices around the table. We happen to have a more diverse board in regards to race, gender, age, location, etc., ability. And I think that one thing that we do really well is listening to folks. And that means that when we're having conversation with each other, sometimes that listening is tough. Sometimes that listening is, when you said this, I heard this, and that's not okay. But sometimes that listening is, no one else is going to talk about this. We're asking these three people, because if we're having opinions on race, these are the three voices that need to speak first before we add in other voices to the mix. Something I believe that ELM could do better is continued advocacy around race on internship, through the first call process, and in specific outreach to Black and Indigenous persons of color that are going through candidacy, who are queer, LGBTQIA+. There are not many. And as Amanda touched on, with Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries being a predominantly white organization, there are many queer people of color that choose not to be in Proclaim, that choose not to partner alongside ELM. But I can say, as a first call pastor, as someone starting ministry, someone that has been in Proclaim throughout my 4 years of seminary, I couldn't have gone to seminary without Proclaim. I would not have made it through without the connection building that happens in that organization. So encouragement for folks of color to feel safe in that organization starts at a board level. And we're getting better and better at that as the meetings go on. And as society changes and shifts, we're changing alongside.
Great. I think an important distinction too for folks there are two sort of advocacy LGBTQ organizations that really accompany the ELCA. ELM is one of those, which we're speaking to today. The other is Reconciling Works, which has the designation for congregations of reconciling in Christ. And I think that's helpful to understand that Reconciling Works and the RIC designation is for folks in the pews. What ELM accompanies is for folks who are, we say, in the pulpit, deacons who are preaching or serving, pastors who are serving and preaching. The difference is important, and Reconciling Works has those resources for the congregation, for the, again, the folks in the pews, and ELM here is having that for those of us who are going through the process, or those of us who have already been ordained but have come out or would like to have ELM accompany us. One of the good questions that I think is helpful in discussing is, do candidates have to reveal their gender identity or their orientation when applying for a call? Which is sort of interesting because and I'll use two terms that I think are worth unpacking. One is queer meaning not straight or cisgendered. So LGBTQIA, queer is this umbrella term that's going to help with the sort of the letters. The other word is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So if you hear me use BIPOC or queer, those are the words that I'm using. But for BIPOC folks, that's not really hideable. That's not something that they can pass with. But for queer folks, those who have a different gender expression or orientation, is that something that needs to be disclosed outright in the process for either seminaries or candidacies?
You want me to answer that, Kelsey?
Yeah. Or
you can give the what it says on paper, and I'll give the what it doesn't say on paper.
Well, I'll give what it says on paper, and maybe I'll give like also I think what ELM's take would be, which would be like I think the answer is you don't have to, disclose your sexual orientation or gender identity. I think certain things would also beacon to people that you identify in a certain way. So for instance, if you do disclose if you are married or not. And so if your partner or spouse has a gendered name, that might do that. You might offer your pronouns in this process. So I think that I don't think that you have to explicitly say. I think ELM's take on this is, why wouldn't you want to? In the wonderful way of, we think, gender identities and sexual orientations and, diversity of, for our BIPOC siblings is an incredible gift to the church. And, I dream of the day that, churches are saying, please send us a queer candidate, please, we want those gifts, we want that. So, ELM really values public witness, which is a really tender and privileged thing to be able to do. To be able to publicly identify, and also a very vulnerable thing to do. But yeah, Kelsey, what's your take?
So I think okay, I went through the candidacy process in my home synod, which is Metro New York, which is also where I'm serving now. And I had served at like a synodical level when I was a youth. So they were there through like the ugly coming out. So my synod knew, but nowhere did they ask me. Nowhere did they say. There was none of that. There was, they didn't even ask about my partner. So the ELCA still has a ways to go in defining relationship. I talk to Amanda all the time about this. I've been with my partner for a long time, but we are not married. And according to the ELCA, I am single. And so that's where some of the conversation, as Amanda said, starts around gender identity and sexual orientation, is in relationship to marriage. But they never pressured me on questions about marriage or my partner at all, I do know that being openly queer at seminary was like a help. I was able to find kind of who I fit in with, who was also what I would call family, and then create this little microcosm of queer relationship on campus that brought a lot of solace and community. One of the things that Proclaim does really well is that each seminary has a Proclaim representative. Is that true, Amanda? Is it everyone? Okay, just wanted to make sure.
And even some of the non-Lutheran seminaries like Harvard Divinity School, Princeton, Yale, yep.
Yeah, so we had events. We like made coffee and hung out and got to know each other. And we invited folks that we knew weren't in Proclaim, but wanted to attend. But like Amanda said, it was a joy. That doesn't mean it was always a joy. And that doesn't mean that when I was 14, it was a joy. But to publicly serve openly has been a joy.
And I think also to clarify, you know, it's there were documents, and there have been documents, there are documents, you know, within ELCA policy that meant that if you had disclosed that, you know, at previous points in the ELCA's history, that disclosure would have precluded you from serving in the church. That would have been grounds immediately, you know, to not allow you to go forward. There is an aspect of the relationship of power and power dynamics with marginalized communities, that when a community of power starts to welcome you in, there is this aspect of some folks in marginalized communities will try to do whatever you can to get in, you know, to get access to power, to fit in with the cool crowd, to fit in and feel like you're safe. And so some of that is, I think, you know, Kelsey's point around where this disclosure of gender identity and sexual orientation really come in is around marriage. That's one of those examples where marriage is a heteropatriarchal institution. I'm waiting for the chat function to start now blowing up because I say some of these things sometimes, and that's okay, you know, but it just to recognize that you've had a whole group of people who for a very long time were not allowed to have this thing called marriage, but we had wonderful lives. And what we found was in the diversity of relationships that we had just as meaningful partnership, mutuality, respect. And when marriage became, you know, the standard, it was basically you're welcome as long as you look like us. And I think that's exactly what our church tells BIPOC folk. That's what we're telling queer folk, is you're welcome as long as you look and act like us. And so what we're hoping is that by disclosures of queerness and by empowering our BIPOC siblings to live more fully into identities that feel honest and authentic to your identities, you should be able to walk into that process with that kind of confidence and that kind of joy in who God created you to be. And that's not well received yet totally. In places it is, but it's not yet received totally in that beauty. And so this is where, you know, I think our work kind of comes into play with that.
So when we talk about marriage, and I sort of mentioned the Supreme Court earlier, we talk about the decision of 2013 allowing same-gendered relationships legalized here, and that movement wasn't necessarily the movement of all of the queer folk
how to get this
in the
shares.
Wasn't really necessarily the movement for all queer folk. It in a way centered white men, primarily gay white men. And have you noticed at all, and I'm sort of thinking, when a rising tide brings up all boats, right? And is that the case? Like with marriage, is that the case in the church? Was that decision allowing folks to be married, and even the 2009 decision, did that really let all the boats rise, or did that still center our primarily white folks. And also, I guess I'll add too, with congregations calling queer folks, they've done a really good job of doing the work and calling queer folks. Then has that then allowed for other folks to be called, maybe who are one of, as Amanda was saying, like one off of the cisgendered white gay male? In your experience or in the Proclaim community?
I'm gonna take it. I'm not even gonna ask. So I went to seminary in Philadelphia. I did internship in Southern California, and my internship site, which is part of the requirements for ordained ministry in the ELCA, was our Horizon internship site, kind of curated by the ELCA to uplift diverse ministries of the church. So my internship was the gay internship. That's what they called it at the seminary. That's what my friends in Proclaim referred to it as. And I took my little backpack of gay and boogied down to Southern California, fell in love with it. But what the congregation didn't realize, although I was their 6th intern, is that I was their first intern that wasn't white. They were ready. Rainbow flags waving when I got to the front of the church, rainbow signs that said my name. But after a few weeks of me living there in many identities, being a queer person of color who identifies as a woman in the church. So I got there, and in an internship committee meeting, a meeting for support for me as the intern, I was verbally assaulted by a member of that congregation and of that meeting body for being Black. It went on for like 40 minutes. It was a bit of a tirade, if I say so myself. And it was horrible. And I thought I was gonna take my little gay bag to California, do a year in the sunshine, and go back to Philly, finish seminary, and do the thing. And that wasn't what happened. The congregation, those who were not this member, reacted amazingly, more than I could have ever imagined someone would act. Someone would come to my aid as quickly as they did. But congregationally, I think we need to be open to really looking at ourselves in the mirror and realizing that when we welcome LGBTQ folk, that doesn't mean that we're there. And if we're going to stand as a reconciling Christ congregation, my congregation is RIC, that doesn't just mean that we've checked the gay box and we're good to go. If we're inviting people in with their full identities, varying abilities, gender expressions, hair choices, then we need to really know that we are what we say we are. So that when folks of these varying identities or intersections are coming into our congregations, that we're really welcoming them. And that it's not just come here for a year, stick it out, and then go back to where things are great. So I think 2009 made a lot of strides. I'm thankful for my siblings that spoke from the floor, from their congregations in letters and words and deeds to make that happen. But 2009 was a starting point, not the end at all.
Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I think our tradition has a tendency to address issues in silos. You know, today we're talking about race. You know, tomorrow we're talking about gender. You know, and we operate in that, we have a constitution as an ELCA. And I will say, in my position with ELM, I tend to have access to our greater institution of a church more so than I do the congregational level. So sometimes, it's great to have pastors on this call who can, and I am a pastor, but I now serve more in this kind of larger context. But the way that our church functions is we have a constitution, we have a general beliefs, and then we do these things called social statements. And that's what was passed in 2009. And to do a social statement, it has to be moved from the floor of the churchwide assembly. We do a study for about, many years. The thing about the sexuality study is it started in the 90s, and it came to multiple churchwide assemblies before it was passed. But we tend to operate in these silos. And then once it's passed, we go, whew, what's the next social statement? But what that does is it ignores this point that Kelsey just made about the intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman law teacher who recognized that within the law, you can't just look at a crime, or you can't just look at a circumstance as if it's one thing. You have to recognize all the different layers that impact the life of the person that you're working with. And that's true also of our church. So the idea that, we're lifting all ships, I think that's still a real white supremacist idea that if we allow people in, then it must be then okay. And I think another example of that is why last week when, the Supreme Court, said, yes, LGBTQIA folk are, protected under the civil rights, law. For just a second, Republicans were cool with that. But when DACA was supported on Thursday, not cool with it. My take is because gay rights are perceived as white rights, and DACA is not. And I think within movements, there's been scrutiny of the LGBTQIA movement. At pride parades, there have been Black people protesting them because they don't feel welcome. Women's rights movements, Black women were not included in that. We're not given the vote. So there still has to be scrutiny within our movement. There still has to be scrutiny when we think that something is passed. And for the last little bit, I think, we also need to recognize when, something like the human sexuality study was passed with such compromise that it's such a benign document ultimately. And I think what it has done is it has stalled our church more than it has really helped our church. And it means that then when you disagree, you either really disagree and everything feels like a fight, as opposed to being a denomination of ever reforming, ever discussing, ever engaging, ever being made new. We say these words, but I'm not sure that we always live them out.
So there's some good questions in the chat that we'll move into here in about 2 or 3 minutes. But on that, since this is a call hosted by Reformation DC, though there are a variety of congregations and ministries represented, and I'm so glad. But in that, with that tone and recognizing the word Reformation, what does Reformation look like in the next couple of years for ELM and for this church, specifically centering around BIPOC folks and BIPOC queer folks?
This is a tough question. I feel thrown. No, I'm just kidding. What does it look like? My ice cream man is throwing a fit outside right now, so I'm sure you guys all can hear. I am not going to leave you for Mr. Softy, I promise. The church looks more Black, more queer, same theology. I'm all about grace. That's what I'm attaining to, and more leadership from those intersections, more church-wide leadership from those intersections, and not just head of multicultural ministries for the ELCA, and not just African descent ministries for the ELCA, or all of those subcategories that we kind of pour into every once in a while, but not only from a church-wide standpoint, but synodically as well. I think the Conference of Bishops has gotten more diverse in the past 2 years than maybe in the past 20. People are elbowing their way through, and I think that that call is one that I'm encouraging many more of my siblings to take in stride if they feel so called, so that the church can reflect the world just a little more closely.
I think I would only add to that, it's a place in which white fragility needs to be addressed, and we need to be willing to be vulnerable. We need to be willing to, I think there's this idea in our tradition of good order, and I think that is a very white idea, and or it's a very white capitalist, heteronormative order. Things have a role, things have a place, and I think that is not the creation that God made. God made a creation that has like bursting stars and messy swamps, and I don't know, like the pollen is like, I don't know why that's not good order, but we need to be willing to be uncomfortable, and not for this. And I want to be careful that I think people with privilege need to be willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of radical change. And I think there's also like some really tangible steps that need to happen, that every time we're given the opportunity to update or change a policy, and this is what we're doing with ELM too, like full disclosure, we are not perfect in this, but you need to then look at it and say, how is this document racist? How is it holding people back? Who's not part of the conversation? Are we just holding on to this for the sake of good order? Or are we doing it because it liberates the people of God to live more fully into that grace that, Kelsey talked about? And I think that process is messy. That process takes time. That process is going to feel weird. And if anything, there's a gift of queerness that we bring, of like, we've lived through that, and we might have something to offer you church, of ways of how we could get through. Right now in this pandemic, I talk about with ELM how crisis calls for creativity, and you're probably seeing it in your own congregation, but that's exactly what marginalized people like have lived through. They've and counted as a gift, counted as a cherished gift that it could be offered to the church. So to me, it's one that's going to have to be a truly reforming church is going to have to be one that is just a bit uncomfortable for a while, so that we can live into the beautiful mess and creativity that I think is actually where we're called to be.
Wonderful. And both of you sort of almost went there, and what I'm hearing too is deep, deep love for this church. And I think that's what many of these movements have come, is deep, deep love for this church. So thank you both for taking my questions. We'll spend again around 15 minutes now answering some of the questions. One of the questions that was brought up was about what's the generational makeup of ELM? And does it support just those candidates who are out in the candidacy process? Or what about those folks who come out later in life, or folks that maybe even are second career and join? What does that look like for ELM?
ELM, and to be clear, ELM as an organization is small. We're just 4 staffers, and we have a board of directors. Proclaim is our professional community. That's really the group of 400 members. And I would say that there is great age variety and diversity of our membership. I think that there are a lot of younger queer folk who are discerning a call to ministry, maybe through college and high school, and they're going to seminary. So maybe our seminarians kind of trend young, and maybe Kelsey, you can kind of either, kind of confirm or deny. But we absolutely have people who are coming out later in life, who, came out a long time ago, left the ELCA, and are coming back because now they can serve in our church. We have members who were LCMS pastors who, in discerning their sexuality, came out and had to leave their tradition and now serve in the ELCA. So there is a great age range of the folks that we serve. And it's kind of the interesting thing for ELM, you know, for a long time, it was like, how do we get people called and how do we support them at the beginning of their call? And now we're saying, how do we help people prepare for retirement? You know, like it's a wonderful question to have to ask.
Great.
Can I pop in very quickly?
Yeah.
Okay, just on the seminarian front, since I'm a little more close to that, there was a newer resurgence of what we would call pipeliners, folks that come to seminary straight from undergrad. While I was at seminary in Philadelphia, there was a large number of pipeliners, but most of the folks that are entering into seminary as someone who just recently was working on an admissions team that are incredibly diverse in age, career path, trajectory to ministry. And that has been one of the greatest joys from an admissions standpoint, was seeing folks come through who could not be ordained prior to 2009 that are now saying, I felt this call for 30 years, but I couldn't serve. And now I'm ready and willing to answer that call. I feel more prepared. So Amanda is correct. The age range is vast, and it is great to be colleagues across generations and intersections and locations with each other. I think we provide one another a lot of support.
I have 2 more questions in the chat, but I want to say, does anyone have a question they'd like to speak out loud? If not, I can move on to these good questions. Yeah, Erica?
I was just wondering if you all thought the first episode of the new season of Queer Eye would have a positive effect on kind of seminary and just recruiting queer pastors.
Well, Erica, you know I love Philadelphia. Noah's episode of Queer Eye was outstanding. A lot of my friends that live in Philadelphia are Jewish, and I had my friends reaching out saying, can I go to that church? I live in that neighborhood. Is that church? Can I go? Like, people are really finding out that the church that they imagined in their head may not be the church that we're living into right now. Seeing all of our colleagues that were featured on that episode and hearing what they had to say, I think not only has opened the door to conversation around what church is, who church is, and why church is, but also that church can be really fun, and that any of the Fab Fives could walk in the door of a church and find a lot of joy and respect and reverence and really help folks, even if they have trauma from past religious experiences.
I'll also just say that ELM and Reconciling work together to create a discussion guide and to that episode. So if you know people who are interested in using that for either for this you suggest, or to even just kind of start to say how has the church been, what is the story, how do we start to bring healing and reconciliation, because I think one of the things that stood out to me about Noah's story was the connection that he had with Bobby, one of the Fab Five, where they talked about how do we create space where kids like us aren't hurt? How do we create a church that doesn't hurt kids the way that we were hurt? And I think that's still a question for any church to answer, and also they bring up this idea of apology and public confession and healing. And I think that's also, something across marginalizations, right? Across the ways that we've treated people. How do we publicly confess and offer, repentance and reconciliation for harms done? So just a little plug. And Pastor Mike also reminded me that Bishop Guy Irwin has just announced that he was selected to be the new president of United Lutheran Seminary, Philadelphia and Gettysburg. And he was the first openly gay bishop, as mentioned, and also the first indigenous bishop. He's a member of the Cherokee Nation. So, yeah,
we rejoiced in many ways with that announcement. Two quick questions. One is around the word queer. Is it appropriate to use in general usage, and or should there be clarifying, kind of like I mentioned earlier, clarifying language? I think that in spaces of, especially LGBTQIA plus spaces, the word queer, I would maybe for younger generations is used pretty often, and recognizing that that word was a slur, is still used sometimes as a slur when especially used as a noun, a little bit of semantics, and it is sort of working its way outside of the LGBTQIA circles into more modern things. It is also used as a verb, which I think is really nice, to queer something, to queer the text, to queer the church, to just make it a little more fabulous. That is what we mean when we say that, recognizing that yes, it has some history to it, it has some weight to it, and it has power when it's taken back into our hands. Another question is about resources. What are the resources needed to make a difference, both now and in the future? Is it money? Is it time? When budgets reflect our values, what is it that is needed? What needs to happen for the future?
What a wonderful question.
Yeah.
Yes to money, yes to time.
I'm like pulling up my book list. We're all here. You got it, guys.
I know. Check out the current New York Times bestsellers. No, I think there is an aspect to saying, how are we not only sustaining our ministry, how are we paying it forward? And I think to examples like Pastor Lenny Duncan, who talks about in Dear Church, how many churches were built by slaves? And do you know if that's your church? And if so, what would it look like to look up the generations of folks who built your church, find their current living relatives, and pay them reparations for the work that was done to build your church? What does it look like to what does reparations look like for a congregation like Reformation? What does reparations look like for an organization like ELM? These are the questions that we're trying to think of. And I think there is, because we still live in such a capitalist world, there is something very powerful to examining where we put our money and what resources we invest in. And resources are also people. So I think that's one thing. Kelsey, I'm going to give you a chance to answer. I know we're short on time.
So I can add them in the chat or make sure that Pastor Ben gets them. But two books that have meant tons and tons to me in how I do the work in the church. When They Call You a Terrorist is the title of the book by Patrice Cullors. I'll make sure to add it in the chat. Patrice is one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a movement that just by name causes a lot of fuel and fanning for a variety of reasons. But the movement itself was started by Black, queer, and trans women. And the book looks at the various intersections of policing, of over-policing, of redlining, gentrification, race, gender identities, sexuality, in a really fantastic way that not only invites you in to learn more about Patrice and her work in as an abolitionist, but also the foundation of the movement, why it was started, what are its aims, what are its goals. And the second book is I'm Still Here. I think it's called Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. I remember starting that book and finishing it, and it felt like just a moment had passed. It has a really good analysis of some of the powers at play in why we can or cannot make change. And I really like to point folks to the physical resources, because I think that education across intersections is the best way in knowing where folks are at and how to meet them where they're at, which is where I believe the movement is going. Lenny Duncan, who Amanda mentioned, pastor in the Pacific Northwest, previous pastor of my congregation, and author of Dear Church. In some of his talks, he says, everyone gets to start where they start. And because Lenny is a close friend of mine, I take that from him time and time again. I'm not asking you to start where I am. We're not asking you to start where we are. Everyone gets to start where they start. But what matters is where we go from where we start. So learning where you start, learning where some of the movements have started, and slowly but surely inching our way there, I think is how we create a more Christ-like world, and a world that is devoted to being with one another throughout all struggles.
What a way, what a way to wrap it up. I know there are a few questions in the chat that I apologize we could not get to. I hope that in some ways you were able to hear your question answered a little bit. And before we move into communion, Reformation will start virtual communion at 8:05-ish. Some folks might be coming in. I'd just like to end us in a brief word of prayer, if that's your thing. If not, you can stay and join us for that, or you may hop off. But let us pray. Good and gracious God, you have made us beautiful in your image, and we give you thanks for the particular ways that you created each and every one of us, and that you call us beloved. And we thank you for this time together, the spirit that has connected our hearts and our minds and our internet. And we ask that you send us out into this world to continue doing your work, continuing to center those who are on the margins, continuing to recognize our neighbors and love them as we love ourselves. We ask you be with us tonight and in this evening, and as we depart from this place, trusting that you are close and knowing that you are listening even now. Amen.
Amen.
Y'all, thank you so much. A special thank you to Kelsey and to Amanda, two incredible pastors in our midst that I am lucky to be in relationship with. Thank you all for being here as well. It is so great to see so many wonderful faces. I really appreciate your time this evening. We will talk to you soon.
Thanks for the invitation. Good to see you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.